Okay, sorry about this. I tried to fix it, but I don't know, it's just broken. All right, so it is, about time to start. We have a bit more than usual slides tonight, 130, 20. So most of them are not on your exam, so don't worry about that. I will tell you which ones are. So tonight's lecture is going to be one of the most interesting lectures we've had so far, because we are going to connect everything that we have learned so far, and we are going to see what deep learning is. We are going to see how we can use deep learning in just a few lines of code in MATLAB to do our coursework, or other things which are less important. So, so far, what we have talked about is we have started with understanding human visual system, how we see things, how our eyes and our brain work together. Then we understood how computers see those images, what a pixel is, how we can have RGB values, how we can use different color channels. Then we talked about image features and filtering. We understood how we can extract edges from images, corners, and like color, texture, and information like that. We talked about image segmentation, which was understanding which label, which pixel has which label. So we wanted to say, let's say, this is the coin, this is the background, this is the bird, this is the background. These are different image segmentation models. Then we talked about supervised learning. We understood what support vector machines are, what a multi-layer perceptron does, and understood how we can use labels to train our model. We solved a very simple perceptron together. We started with randomly initialized weights, and then we did some training until our model could draw that line that separates our classes from each other. We talked about unsupervised learning, where we didn't have labels, so we wanted to find clusters in our information. We wanted to understand the spatial relationship that they have with each other in self-organizing maps. Tonight, which is my last lecture, and I'm going to talk about biologically inspired vision and deep learning. And then for the next 3 lectures, we are going to have Greg, Professor Greg Sleva, who was a senior lecturer here, and he has recently left City University. And he's a very, very good lecturer. We started this module together, and now he has left, so I am only the only lecturer here, but he will be our guest lecturer for the next 3 lectures. And he will be talking about 3D vision, when we want to understand information from environment to see the objects in a 3D environment. So far we have been looking at 2D environments. He will talk about videos and motion, how we process videos, how we can track, for example, an item or an object or a car or a bike in a video. Then he will talk about multi-view stereo, where when you have, for example, 2 cameras of the same scene, how you can use that information, like our eyes, where we have 2 eyes, so we have a stereo information. So we will see how we can use the stereo information for understanding depth, for example. And then we have a review on the state of the art of deep learning in those topics mainly. So I look forward to these lectures, but let's get on with what we have tonight. So last week we talked about unsupervised learning, k-means, mean shift, self-organizing maps, and we said what a dictionary of features is. And we learned what SIFT and SELF are, how we can extract more complex features from images, which would be more meaningful and would be more useful, more robust to invariances, to the variations that we have in our environment. We had an example of a green screen. You played with it in the lab, and you could create a panoramic image from the, basically from different images of the same object. What we're going to talk about tonight is going to be an overview of biologically inspired image classification. And then I will go through HMAX model, and then very quickly through what I have done during my PhDs and 3 postdocs. And then I will start with deep learning. We will talk about deep learning. We will talk a lot about different models in deep learning. We will understand what deep learning essentially is, how it works, and then we will take it from there to get more advanced and more advanced models. But I will tell you which parts are on your exam, because I know this module, this lecture is like one whole course on on this topic, so I don't want you to know everything for your exam. So don't worry, but try to learn as much as you can. This lecture can help you a lot later once you are going to develop your understanding of deep learning to see which areas you are more interested in and what areas you want to work on. And we will solve your coursework tonight in 10 lines. Again, as always. So we have started with human visual cortex. So what happened in computer vision society was computer vision models, which were basically edge detection, SIFT features, support vector machines, neural networks at the time. They were reaching a cap. They were like getting to their max usefulness, and they weren't really practical. They had a lot, most of the accuracies were in the range of 50, 60, 70%, and people were not really investing in that area. It wasn't that useful. They were investing, but they weren't getting really good results. So people started to look into human brain. And because our brains are amazing in classification, in segmentation, and things like that, people started to study human brain to see how our brain works. So if you remember from the first lecture, we said the brain has a structure like that, which is a hierarchical structure. Once we see something and the image is on our retina, the cones and rods in our eye convert that light into a value that is an electric signal, and it goes all the way back to the brain. And then there are layers on top of each other. We have simple cells and complex cells. So we will talk about that. But the idea is the brain has a hierarchical structure, and in the earlier layers, it detects edges and then surfaces, and then color is added, motion, and then we have the IT, which does the object recognition. So coming from this background, it goes all the way back to 1959 when Hubel and Wiesel, they proposed simple and complex cells in the brain. So the idea is very simple. We have simple cells which are tuned to an oriented bar in one specific orientation. So we said that we have those S1 cells in the V1 area, where if you have a bar like that, they start firing, but if the bar is outside their receptive field, they don't fire anymore, or if it's another orientation, it doesn't fire that much. So that specific cell fires to a specific orientation. How can we model that with a computer program? Just run an edge detector which has a bar in that orientation, right? Something like a Gabor filter. So we can simulate that. And based on this very simple idea and other ideas that existed at the time, many people started studying human brain and started looking into different aspects and trying to come up with different models. So I started my PhD in 2008, and when I started it, I was roughly here. So the state of the art at the time was HMAX model. It was a biologically inspired model which was simulating human brain, and I was fascinated by the way they are working on it. It was an MIT work, and we had meetings back in Singapore with the team, and we were working on that. And the idea basically was to understand how brain works. So I'm going to get back to this, but there were other models. For example, Gions was trying to say that all of the objects around us is made of simple architecture structures. So if you have those elemental structures and put them together, you can recreate any object. The idea seems feasible, but it wasn't practical. It couldn't be implemented. Nobody could find those basic structures in the images. So it was more of a psychology or experimental psychology model rather than a computational one. So back to my model, back to what I worked on. We were working on understanding the structure of the brain, how the edge detection is happening in the brain. So as I mentioned, we had neurons. We have neurons in S1, like they are tuned and they fire to specific orientations of bars. So they could help us detect edges. So the difference between a simple cell and a complex cell is that a simple cell fires to a specific orientation, but as soon as the object is outside its view or is longer than its receptive field, that simple cell doesn't see it anymore. It doesn't fire anymore. but a complex cell is on top, and it sees the outcome of a few simple cells. So what it does, it can see it, even if the bar is longer, if it is moving in its receptive field. So it is, they call it simple and complex cells. So simple cells are just on one orientation or a magnitude of that orientation, and complex cells have a bigger receptive field. We will look into that again. So in our brain, we have a columnar architecture, which these S cells are like an array like that, and they start firing, and then we have S1 cells which are connected to outputs of some of these, and they have the invariance to orientations and a scale to some extent. So based on this model, Fukushima in 1980 suggested a hierarchical multi-layer neural network. He had S1 and C1 layers. Yeah.
Ross, how do we know this? Is it based on experiments?
Yeah, these are like neuroscience based on structure. So they look at the structure of the brain, and they show a specific. So the way it works is they have electrodes inside the brain of animals, and they show specific bars, orientations, and they see the firing. And if they start firing, they say, okay, this neuron fires to that specific orientation. So as I said, Fukushima suggested a model which was based on that, but it was successful to some extent. People were working on it, but at the same time, there was this HMAX model, which was a very successful one, and I based my PhD on that. So I'm going to go a bit into details about it, because this is very similar to where deep learning comes from. So I want you to understand what is happening in deep learning. So if you look at an image like this, in S1, you see a bar. So for example, you have a cell that is tuned to this bar, and you have another cell that detects this bar and doesn't detect this bar. So you have different sizes, for example. C1 sees both of these. So they are connected to the C1. Again, here, you have different locations. So again, C1 is invariant to location. As long as it is in its receptive field, it doesn't matter where this bar in our letter A, for example, where this bar in letter A is. It just finds it and it starts firing. So C1 is a more complex way, because it's not really complex. It just has a bigger field of view, and it just takes a max of the S1s in its area, in its lower receptive field. And it's invariant to a scale to some extent, and it's invariant to location, to shift, we call it. So it's shift invariant and a scale invariant to some extent. So the basic idea back in 1999 was that they took some paper clips, and they played with them. They made different shapes, and what they did is, in the beginning, they created some filters, Gaussian filters of different orientations. They applied those filters on those images, and then they took a max to come from here to here. So in a local neighborhood, they took a max, and then they created some S2 features from these C1 features. So now you have these C1 responses. You take like a 3x3, 4x4 box around one area, and you say this is a complex feature. And then you apply that complex feature all over your C1s, and then you create an output. So the way it works is, imagine like you had those, what filters? We had Viola Jones, right? We had those boxes. So in the beginning, you apply those boxes. Imagine you're looking for an eyebrow, for example. So you're looking for something that is bright, black, bright, right? So this is a very simple filter you're applying. So now you have done this all over, and you get the outcomes. So the next one is you combine a bit of those outcomes together. So now you have bright, black, bright, again black, again bright, right? If the eye is closed, for example, you see the eyelids. So you have this more complex feature. So this is now your complex feature. So you take that, run it all over the previous layer. You don't go to the original image anymore. You do it on the previous layer, and then you generate some results, right? So this is input image, S1, C1. Now you took some C1s, call it features, your bank of dictionary or dictionary of features. you apply those on C1, create S2, right? And then again, you take some from those areas, you do this C2, S3, C3, S4, C4, and you keep doing that. So this is the way you go from simple features like bright, black, bright, to more complex features. And if you do this a few times, on the top, you will see features that are like bright, black, bright, bright, black, bright. So you're now looking at more complex features, right? So this was the idea, and then people started extending on that, and they provided mapping with the brain and said this is how it's where it's coming from. So once you want to publish and you want to show that you are actually doing something, you either have to introduce a new problem with a data set. You say, I have this problem, this is a data set, now people go and solve it. The other way is that you have to come up with a new model. And if you have a new model, you need either a better performance to show that your model is better, and you have to justify it why. You should say, because of these equations, because I am improving on this parameter, I'm reducing this noise and things like that. Or you could say, because this is what's happening in the brain, or this is what's happening. You have like biological inspiration for that. You say where this idea is coming from, right? So this time people were looking at this model and they were trying to come up with biological explanation for that. So you can see there is a mapping with different layers of the brain. This is Sepehr's work in 2005, who was a PhD student of Poggio. So if I want to put it in a nutshell for HMAX model, the way it works is you have an image. Because you want invariance to scale, what you do is you create an image pyramid. So I take my image and resize it to smaller and smaller and smaller, up to 10 sizes. So I create a pyramid from that image so that I have different versions of features. So if I have let's say my hand, I have it in a smaller, smaller, and smaller, so that once I see that in the test image, regardless of the size of the hand, I can still find that hand, right? So I create a pyramid of images. I have a bank of filters. In the later versions, they did Gabor filters. So I did also Gabor filters, 12 orientations instead of Gaussian. I apply these Gabor filters on this image pyramid, and then I have this output, which is S1 layer. The next step is a local 3D max. So I have 10 layers from layer, so if I call the first layer layer 0, from layer 0 to layer 9. So from layer 0, 1, and 2, I look at one location and I take the max in a 3D environment. We had that in SIFT as well, right? So the lower scale, higher scale, and environment, a neighborhood of that. Lower, same scale, and the higher scale. So we take the max in that scale, and then by doing that, we are reducing the size as well as the size of the pyramid as well as the dimensions of the x and y of it. So I create a C1 layer. The next step is I take patches from this C1 layer, 4 by 4, 16 by 16, 12 by 12, whatever size you like. And then you put them somewhere called the dictionary of features. This is what we did before as well, right? So we create a dictionary of features, and then I multiply this dictionary of features on C1 layer and calculate S2 layer. And here what I do is by multiplying, I mean finding the closest item. So I calculate the distance from each 4 by 4 area in this C1 layer with a 4 by 4 filter that I have in this bank, and I calculate the distance, how similar is this object to the one I have in my dictionary of features. And then I take the maximum, which is the best match to that dictionary feature that I have, and I create a vector. This vector is the size of this dictionary of features. So what happens here, if I have 4,000 features here, basically what I am doing is I am taking the distance, the closest one in this one to this specific feature. Let's say the closest, the least amount of distance you can have is 1, that is 0, which means this item is exactly the same as the one you had. and the furthest is 1, which means they are very, very, very far from each other in that 4x4 space that you have. So what I create here is a 4,000 dimensional vector. Is it clear? Right? So what I am doing, again, because this happens in deep learning as well, we want to understand this together. What I do is I take the input image, I create a pyramid of the sizes, I have some fixed filters, kernels that I've had like before, like those Gaussian filters, for example. Here I have Gabor filters. They are edge detection, orientation detection. I apply it on the image. I create S1. I take the maximum, the best response. I create C1. From C1, I take patches. I create a dictionary of features. From the dictionary of features, I compare each individual item, each individual 4x4, 8x8, 12x12, 16x16, whatever size I have, with the patches of the same size in this one, all over this pyramid for each individual image. And I find the distances, and I take the max, which is the best distance that I could find. And then I create a C2 layer. So in this particular setup, if two items are exactly the same, we get a response of 1, and if they are very far from each other, we get a distance of 0, right? So I create a vector between 0 and 1, which is 4,000 dimensions. So I have converted the image, which could have been any size, into a 4,000 dimensional vector. And then I send it to a classifier. In this case, it was a support vector machine. So I have 4,000 features extracted, a feature vector extracted, 4,000 dimensions, send it to a classifier, and then the classifier is trained and then learns how to do that. So this simple model, because it has loads of multiplications, you have 12 orientations, you have 10 scales of the image, it takes like weeks, months to run. So let's see, I had tough times with that, but now with deep learning models, we will see how it is simplified. So what's happening here is we have C2 layer, a feature vector, and then send it to a classifier. So this is what roughly they look like. So if you're doing like this orientation, you see these edges highlighted in the image. If you have something like that, you see these edges and these edges and these edges, and this is what C1 looks like. It's a max of the S1. So this is what C1 looks like, and you can illustrate it and go higher and higher. So this is a little bit more information about S1 units, like the biological inspirations. You don't need to bother with that. Again, the key point is that S1s are something like that. They are detecting orientation, and C1s take a max in a red neighborhood so that they are invariant to scale and position, right? So then we have S2 units. There is more biological inspiration, where they are, how they are working, and then you have C2 units, and then you could go higher and higher and see where you want to stop. So the dictionary of features is a key thing in this model, because you have to understand that the features you are comparing all your images with make sense. They are discriminative enough. So in order to create that feature and compare it and calculate this value, this distance between a feature and the patch in your image, you have different ways. Different people try different models, but if you want to input all possible combinations in your dictionary of features, if you have n different parts, all possible orientations, and k possible locations, you are going to end up with 137 billion possibilities with only these small numbers. So you cannot store all possible features. You want an optimal way of creating that dictionary of features. This is a problem you may have in your coursework as well. How do you create your dictionary of features? So one of the ways you can do that is, imagine you have 100 classes, 100 faces, right? 100 students in your class. And from each class you have 30 images, for example, 10 images, 20 images, whatever number you have. So there are several ways that you can create your dictionary of features. One way is you want, let's say, what I want in the end is a dictionary of features of size 10,000. One way is you create 100 features from each class randomly. Randomly select 100 features, or in your SIFT model, pick the strongest features. Pick the top 100 strong from each class, not each image. For each person, you have 30 images. You create 10,000 features from all of those images. Pick the 100 strongest, and then you have 100 classes. 100 times 100 is 10,000. So you create a dictionary of size 10,000. This is one way. Another way is you take 10 strongest from each individual person, and then add it to this 100. So in the first one, I didn't take 10 from each person. I took all from each person and combined them together. I had like 50,000 from one person, all of these images, and then I picked the 100 strongest. In the second one, I am taking the 10 strongest from each individual person. The other way is just put everything together that you extract from all individuals, and then in the end, take the 100 strongest or 10,000 strongest that you want. The other way is not take the strongest or random. Do clustering. This is what MATLAB does by default. What it does, it takes from individual images and then clusters them to 10 or 20 or whatever number, and you have those as your dictionary of features. Or takes 100 from each image, creates 10,000 here, and then clusters them. So there are different ways that you can play with that. Another way is called sampling over saliency points, the points that are more significant. Like you remember in SIFT, for example, the way we did it was we were trying to find the corners. Like we can't find the points that are brighter, darker than their neighborhood as well, like creating blobs. So we could sample from those points, hoping that we get better points. You could do self-organizing maps on them, organize your clusters together. You could do k-means clustering. These are all the things that you could do. So you have a general idea now how to create that dictionary of features, and you have a general idea how simple and complex cells work. So the other thing that I did in my PhD was I added color to this model. So this model was basically grayscale. So it was taking the image, converting it to grayscale, detecting edges, and doing this structure on that. One of the things that I did was, apart from testing all different models for creating that dictionary of features and comparing them, I also extracted colors, created something called quantization cores, or I called my model color quantization Hmax. And then I did find the dominant colors in each area, and then created the same architecture here and created another vector. And instead of max pooling, I did a mean pooling as well. So instead of taking the best response, I took the average of the best responses as well. So instead of having, say, a 4,000 dimensional vector, I had a 4,000, 4,000, 4,000, 12,000 dimensional vector, and then I sent it to the classifier. So this is another one. So my works were like a dictionary of features, comparing the max with mean, co-occurrence of the features to see if two features are occurring together frequently. I encoded the co-occurrences. I said if I see an eye and I see another eye, then I can create a two-eye feature. That might be helpful for finding faces, for example, and things like that. And then I added color to the model, and this was like on different data sets, I could show that this was the baseline performance of this model, and then my model worked like that. So on different baselines I could improve, and this is how you get a PhD. Yeah.
And if your soccer data set improves so dramatically compared to others?
It's because I added color to it. Because shape in soccer data set is generally a misleading clue, because all are human and they all have human shape. But once you add color, so the only good way, the only reason it's improved, there is any performance, is because some clothes that players wear have patterns that are distinguishable. But if your patterns are like, all of them are striped t-shirts or shirts, and then you have like different colors, then color model can help, but shape cannot. So color was useful in that particular data set significantly. And at the time, my performance on flowers, scenes, not on, I think on soccer and flowers, I was state of the art at the time when I was publishing. So this is some results that I got, and just a general idea of what simple complex features are, and how we can get invariance by going from simple to complex, right? We also applied that model on a histopathology challenge, a Nikai, and my model also improved very significantly. Then I did a postdoc on, I created a data set where we were, it involved a bit of diving to collecting images from underwater for different benthal marine life. So we wanted to study their life, how they're growing or dying. And then I compared my model, and like using SIFT and SVM, I got 52%, but my model got like 62% on that data set. So I was very happy, and so were my supervisors. So we had then the other one was I worked on underwater visibility. So we didn't have good vision underwater because the waters around Singapore are really polluted. So if you have an object, we had a tank which was filled with ocean water in Tropical Marine Sciences Institute, and if you put an object in 1 meter depths to 1.5 and so on, so after 2 meters you cannot even see the object anymore. So I was looking for a way to improve visibility. Vision alone wasn't working, so instead of looking at human brain and cat brain for vision, this time we said, okay, dolphins can see very clearly because they have sonar. So, you know, dolphins do have sonar. It's very similar to what bats do on the ground. So what they do is they send a signal, and based on the reflections that they get from the environment, they can echolocate. They can understand where they are and the environment around them. So they don't need vision because they're mainly living in caves and there is no light there. So this is the way they have evolved. Dolphins as well, they have this system, sonar system, underwater. They send a signal, and then based on the feedback that they get, the brain processes it, and they can understand what environments around them looks like, and they try to avoid obstacles. Is this biologically inspired? Again, I have to justify why I'm doing it. So I find biological inspiration in other mammals or animals. And what I did was a very basic idea, basic implementation. We put sensors and emitters of a signal, and we had an emitter which would send a signal, and based on the reflections that we would get from different receivers, we would save that signal. So the signal we would get was something in a 3D dimension, like 3 dimensions, right? It goes and echoes and comes back. So what I see from the signal, I take that 3D cube, and then I crop it, 16 different times stamps that I have, put those 16 images next to each other, which looks something like this. So if I have an object like this, the sonar reflection is something like that. And if I have something like this, the reflections look something like this, and so on. And when I feed the same thing to my model as an image, I get very good results. Initially, in long range, I couldn't see anything. This 16.7 is random chance if you assign everything to one class, right? So I had 6 classes. So if you assign everything randomly to one, you get 16%, but if you use sonar, you get 94%. So it was improving vision. Where there is no vision, you could have those sensors and see underwater. So here is a bit of publications on that, if you're interested. Then I came to City University, and what I did was I was working with tennis videos. So the goal here was to understand, if I show you this video, what do you think the result, where is he going to kick? Is it going to be a line shot next to the line, or is it going to be a cross-court shot? Cross or line? Who says cross? Who says line? Okay. Those of you who say line, why? Is there any specific or just a random guess? And those of you who say cross, any reason? Why do you think it's a cross?
It's the posture of the hand and the ball is from hands.
Okay, so let's see the reality. Okay, you win. So, the goal here was to see what features are in that specific video that you could anticipate it. So if you're playing against Federer, for example, he doesn't wait for you to, as soon as you throw the ball, he knows and just is there, waiting for you to respond. So what is it that he knows that we don't know? So in order to do that, I'm just trying to give you an idea of how challenging data collection is. So in order to do that, we had to collect data from experts and novices, and we had to compare that. And experts are not easy to get. You couldn't say, hey, Federer, I have a study. Would you please come over and do it? I pay you £10 an hour. So it won't work like that. But for students, it worked. So we had enough novices, but the problem was getting experts. So we had to go all over the country to different competitions and do a setup there, ask them, please do this for us. So the way we did it was using something called classification images. It is not image classification. It is different. And when I first read that, I thought, okay, a bunch of psychologists, they don't know what image classification is, and they just even use the wrong name for it. But later I realized it's a thing, actually. So classification image is, imagine you have a signal, signal 1, signal 2. What they do is they add noise to it, and they create a stimulus. And then they show this stimulus to participants, and they record their response. So based on the amount of noise that has been added, and based on the correctness of these responses, they add the ones that were signal 1, but were detected as 2, plus the ones that were, they take the means, and then the ones that were signal 2 detected as 2 minus the ones that were signal 1 detected as 1, or signal 2 detected as 1, and then they create this image. So you have a classification image. So if you multiply this image on signal 1, you can clearly see that these bits are black, so you get a very low response. And if you multiply this on signal 2, the vertical bits are white, so you get a high response. So if you multiply your signal into this classification image, you can classify it. You can say this is class 1 or class 2. It's a very genius way of doing it for simpler two classes. So the way we did that was we showed these videos. It's a clear video. This is temporal bubbles. We call them bubbles, which is covering the image. Instead of noise, instead of adding noise, here what we did was we hid information. So here we are hiding information, and we are showing these videos to people, and we want to see how much information they need to be able to detect. So we show it clear videos, and we record your performance. Well, yes, you are 70% accurate. And then we do with occlusion, okay, you're now 60% accurate. If I show you 10 frames, if I show you 4 frames, you're 50% accurate. So then I increase the number of frames you can see or decrease it according to your performance. Then we had the spatial bubbles. They were fixed throughout the video. You couldn't see some part of the video. Then we had the spatial temporal bubbles, which could change throughout the video. So all of this I wrote the code with MATLAB. So in MATLAB you can do GUI, like graphical user interface. Here is some information. So what you can do, you can create a menu and then choose which is what part. You can sort your columns and things like that. So you can use MATLAB for such things as well. And then I had this setup, if this place works. So you would stand in front of a computer and you would run or jump. As soon as you see, you have to anticipate, then you run to the right or to the left. So that, and then you receive feedback, and then you keep doing that. Okay, so I'm just showing that so that you know these things are possible with MATLAB. MATLAB is not just for one line of code. And this is the main paper on this. If you're interested, it's like 40, 50 pages. So these are the results. We have temporal results. It shows that like in this area, like 60 milliseconds before ball contact, most of the information is acquired. And then this is after ball contact, where everyone was now safely detecting correctly and things like that. And these were the spatial locations where players were looking. So the key one was the ball and racket, to connect contact point and the head of the player. So these were the things that seemed to be more significant. So this is a bit of publication on that. We have the pre-op and intra-fundus images. This is the work with UCL. So the idea here is to develop a robot that can help the surgeon be more accurate. So it's not going to replace surgeons, we still need them, but what this robot is going to do is going to provide more accuracy. So the way it would work is we have these images, which is preoperative, very clean, these are retinal images, and then we have these images which are intraoperative. As you can see, there is a tool reflection, different shades of color on them, there are different problems on the retina of different patients, they have different pathology. Some of them are blind, some of them have some other issues that you have to deal with. So we have different sources for storing that information. We have the vessels, we have something called the OCTA, optical coherent tomography angiography. Then we have IOCT, and this is what the preoperative one looks like, very clean, clear lines. You can see which layer is where. So this is our fovea. This is a relatively healthy person. So this is the way our fovea is. So here, these are the parts of the cones and rods on it, and this person has a bit of detachment. So anyway, and this is what we get intraoperatively. You can see this is much less visible. We don't have those clean layers, and it's very difficult. So our team, which we are working on this at Northfields Eye Hospital, they recently sort of cured 2 blind people. So 2 people who had gone blind from AMD, age-related macular degeneration. They received an injection of stem cells, so their fovea cells were gone. And fovea, as I said, also it is a very, very small portion of our retina. If the cells in that area die, we go blind. Because most of our vision, we just see around, we are looking in a very weird environment. We don't see much, we can't read. But the way this worked was they injected the stem cells in those areas, and those patients can see now. So this is a story on BBC, you can have a look. But the goal now that this work is about is to use this preoperative information, use it intraoperatively, and help build a robot that can be more accurate and do more surgeries and do more accurate surgeries and deal with more pathologies and work with, help more patients. And this is a bit of publication on that. So, that all being said, now we are at machine learning. We have talked about machine learning. You know what machine learning is. Basically, machine learning is trying to understand that line between your data. Is this class 1 or class 2? From the data you had before. Most of its applications are supervised, where you know this is a failure for a mortgage application and this is an acceptance for mortgage application. You have data, you have labels, you know which one is which, and now you're trying to find that line. This is the basic idea. You can use it for forecasting. You have had a lot of data like that, now you look at a new pattern. What is it going to be happening in the future? What's going to happen in the future? So you can use it for imputing missing data, for detecting anomalies, for classifying, for ranking, for summarizing, and for decision making. So these are major applications of machine learning. But generally, the idea is to extract patterns from the data that you have and use it for understanding what is going to happen with unseen data. What is the pattern? Is there a pattern or not? And data mining also involves basically 6 main areas. Anomaly detection, association rule learning, clustering, classification, regression, and summarization. Data mining and machine learning have a lot in common, but there are differences. You have to understand them. If you are interested in that, there is a link. You can look for the differences between these two. But data mining is mainly about data and how you can understand your data, you can extract diagrams from it, you can understand patterns in your data. You can use machine learning for data mining, and you can use machine learning to anticipate the future from your data. So there are some minor differences in this area, but machine learning is like an application. It's more a general term for finding the patterns and predicting the future and looking at unseen data. And machine learning is used in data mining as well. So, deep learning, the best part of modern machine vision. So deep learning is basically a stack of neural networks on top of each other. And how many of you are familiar with deep learning and have done deep learning before? Okay. And the rest have no idea what deep learning is, or in your machine learning course you have like a general idea? Okay. So I will try to explain it in very simple words because the majority seems to like that. And then we will take it from there. There are different models for deep learning. We have deep neural networks, deep belief networks, convolutional neural networks, which will be on your exam, convolutional deep belief networks, large memory storage, and retrieval neural networks, LSTM. No, not this one. This is not LSTM. This is LSTM. Recurrent neural networks and long short-term memory. So here is an introduction to machine learning and deep learning. You can have a look, but I will go through them and I will tell you the differences between them, and we will go in more detail about convolutional neural networks. So if you want to have a look at general deep learning models, there are a lot of different shapes. Based on the way these neurons are connected to each other, everyone has come up with a name for them, for a model, and they have published. So deep learning is mainly neural networks nowadays. Most of them are neural networks, and it's basically the idea of putting perceptrons together, and instead of MLPs, it's now using kernels. So we will see how it works. So we will start today's lecture in this bit about neural networks, what they were, have a quick recap on perceptron, and then we will go with more details about NLP, and then have a quick talk about DNN, RNN, LSTM. Our main focus is on CNN. In MATLAB, it is ConvNet. There is a toolbox called ConvNet, which is now outdated, so you don't need to use that. This is slides from a lecture from MIT, which is on YouTube. I just screenshot it. You have neural network operations, convolution, pooling, activation function, and backpropagation. These are important to understand, and they have been seen to be. So, neural networks. What is a neural network? You remember that from lecture 5. The way it works, let's start with a perceptron. You want to find a line that classifies your objects. You have some values here, you have some values here, and you want the equation for the line. So based on the dimensionality of your data, you add a bias, and you initialize those weights randomly, and you run your input on those random weights, create an output. If it is correct, good. If it is not correct, you calculate an error, you update those random weights, you run it through your data again, you calculate the output. If it is correct, good. If it is not, you update that error and keep doing that for 10,000 iterations until you either are tired, which means you have reached the max number of iterations, or you have reached perfect performance or an acceptable performance. So this is the way a perceptron works, right? Any questions on that? Is this simple? Because this is important. All good? Okay. So this is perceptron, and this is the update weight. The update vector. You can update the weight vector by this equation. So this is the weights in iteration n plus 1 equal to the weights in iteration n plus learning rate times the error generated times the input, and then the error generated is the desired output minus calculated output. So you could keep doing that and just put this en here. You have only one equation, and you keep updating your weights, and your network is now, after like 10,000 iterations, is going to classify everything correctly. Then we realized that a simple perceptron is not enough to classify everything. We realized we cannot do an XOR problem. So what we did was we put 2 neurons and added a third one, which would look at the outputs of these 2. So we have multi-layer perceptron. So we have the same thing. We are updating the weights, but here it looks a bit more complicated because instead of only 1 neuron, you're updating the weights across your network. So you're going back. So imagine you have 1,000 neurons here, you have 5,000 neurons here, and you have 5,000 neurons here, and you have 5,000 neurons here. Everybody is connected to each other. And if you want to do these updates, you will have to update 10,000 times 5,000 times 2,000 times 3,000 times whatever number times of neurons you have. So the number of updates would have been millions. And it would take months to update a network which is big. So neural networks weren't practical. Nobody loved them anymore because they were very, very slow. If you wanted to tune a lot of parameters, because they are fully connected, each neuron is connected to all other neurons, right? So to the next layer, not inside each layer. So they are connected to the next layer. So they are called fully connected layers. So each of them is connected to all others. So if you have 10,000 weights, you have 10,000 weights, and you want to update everything, you are going to end up with millions of updates, which is going to be super slow. And neural networks didn't provide that accuracy as fast support vector machines, so nobody looked at them anymore. They were almost dead. Don't worry about the equations. GPU and CUDA. So 2 things happened. 1 was internet, and 2 was gaming. So because of gaming, people needed better graphic cards. You wanted graphic cards that could process more videos and they could be fast so that you could play your GTA in real time, high quality, and enjoy the graphics of the game, for example. And at the same time, we had internet, so we had access to unlimited amounts of selfies, photos, and pictures of nature, pictures of every possible object that you have in mind. You can find thousands of it online. So given the story about gaming resulted in super fast GPUs. So one of the ways that they calculate the power of a computer is by its flops, floating operations per second, how many operations this computer can take care of. So back in 1999, the fastest supercomputer in the world had like 2.379 teraflops or 2,000 gigaflops. Today, you can buy an NVIDIA 2080 Ti about $900, and you get 27 teraflops if you do half floating points. Or if you do full floating, you get 13.5 teraflops. So you can see you're almost 6 times faster than the fastest supercomputer with only spending less than 1,000. So GPUs are super, super fast. The way they work is a CPU, it has a few cores. So you have like a quad core, dual core, and CPUs like that. So they can do a maximum of, let's say, 4, 8, 16 operations at the same time. So they are serial, basically, CPUs. They work sequentially. So one operation after the other. But if you have 4 cores, you can do 4 operations at the same time. But with GPUs, the way they work is they have a lot of ALUs, arithmetic logic units, which they are capable of doing simple operations in parallel. So a typical GPU, for example, this one, which is a good one, this one, has 4,352 cores. So you can run, instead of waiting for 4,000 things to happen sequentially, you can do them in one go. So the reason that deep learning is there is because we have the computational power. People were very smart and they said, why only use it for gaming? Let's use it for deep learning, right? So the way it works is you have a bunch of simple operations, multiplications basically, right? Because what you're doing is you're multiplying those numbers, input numbers, into those random weights, you're generating an output. You are calculating an error signal, you're backpropagating, you're sending those. So these are all basic multiplications. So you can do them in parallel. You can do all of these in parallel. The other thing that we have access to is something called images. We have internet, we have millions of images. Li Feifei is a successful data collector. So she was the one who collected Calpic 101 dataset, for example. And she has thousands of citations. And then they started collecting ImageNet. ImageNet is a huge online data set. It has millions of images, and it keeps growing. I think it's up to 11 million images now, if I'm not mistaken. So they keep adding images to that. But the way it works is they have organized these millions of images. And what people do is you can use those images, which are properly organized into folders and subfolders, something like that. You can use those images and train your models. So what happens here is that you have a lot of power, you have a lot of data, and you run that data with that power on different combinations of those neurons, which is slightly different in deep learning than multi-layer perceptron, which I will talk about it, and you create filters. The interesting thing about neural networks is that you do not feed those filters to your model. You do not give Gabor filters or Gaussian filters. They are randomly initialized numbers. And once the model sees millions of images, through iterations, these models keep updating, and interestingly, they result in something similar to those filters. This is probably how our brain is also creating those filters. Looking at all billions and millions of images around us, since we are a baby, and extracting that information, and our brain keeps doing that until it makes sense of the environment. Those features or those filters are created in our brain. So the idea here is to represent images by a bunch of filters. So if you can represent an image instead of with 10 million pixels, you can represent it with 50 filters, for example. What you're doing is something like sparse coding. So you are getting your model and represent it with a few features. Based on how your input image responds to those features, you create a feature vector and you classify your image. So let's take a break, and then we will come back and continue. One way, we want to take all those 500 features, so you have 10,000 let's say 10,000 features, each image gives you 500 features, so you have 500,000 features. Each is one person. So this is class one, so this is me. Image one, first image of me, image two, second image of me, and so on. All images of all people. 500,000 pictures. Put them here, and then either take the strongest 10,000 or cluster them into 10,000. clusters are not supposed to have labels.
If it's what you're putting in the dictionary means
Is this one?
Yeah, no, not this one.
As European.
Once you're creating a dictionary of features, it doesn't matter which feature belongs to which class. This is one separate step. In the next step, your image looks at all the features in dictionary and responds to only a few of them very well, which makes them. You get what point? No.
still doesn't get labeled. I know.
So you don't imagine your dictionary is not classic. It's not labeled. So just make sure I can erase this. I had another talk and I can't. So let's say this is class 1. Your line is this. Class 2, your line is this. Class 3, you have a line like that. So this is an optimal dictionary of features. This is your dictionary. Nothing is labeled, you don't know. Now you take your image 1. And image 1 generates a histogram like this. You have the labels. Image 2 is something like this. And image 3 is something like this. So this is labeled image, this is labeled, and this is labeled. So now you can create a classifier. You don't need these to have labels. These are your feature vectors and the label.
Got the correct naming.
Have an image which is like that, and I multiply it with this, I see this, good response. I don't see that, low response. I don't see that, low response. If I apply this on this dictionary, I don't see this, low response. I see this, good response. So this is...
Just double check on the theory. It's basically an image, the same image in different sizes.
Use IM resize. Introduce the resolution.
So S1 is actually S1 is actually addition, and C1
Takes the max of a few pixels around each S1 output, which gives it a complex feature. It's a max of C1 is S1. Seems to be working. If not, I will put the last year's lecture capture. I'm recording I hope it's it should be. I've been trying to find out. We'll see how it goes. But the mic is working. So, 1 minute and years.
machine learning or your that's your next question.
Okay, let's start. So we are almost halfway there, and where did I come? Okay. So the idea is that we want to find a way to represent our data with less information than the original data. Instead of storing all those billion possibilities of features, we are going to find a set of representative features that once we apply them on an image and then calculate a response, then we send it to a classifier, and that classifier can do that. So I had an example here during the break, a small discussion. So let's say all your images look like class 1. They are all like that. All your class 2 images are like that, and all those class 3 images are like that. So if you apply this, and then you have some bunch of filters. You're creating a dictionary of features here, right? If you apply that image to this dictionary of features, you will get a good response for this one. You will get less response for these two. If you apply this image to that dictionary of features, you will get something like that. So by applying those filters on our images, we can create a feature vector and then send these feature vectors to a support vector machine or a neural network, multi-layer perceptron. So the whole idea is we need two parts. Part 1, extract features. Part 2, classify them. Part 1, extract features. Using those features that you extracted, create a feature vector. And part 2, send them to a classifier. So now that I have these results, like I have these diagrams, this feature vector here, I can send them to a classifier. And the classifier can find the relationship between them, draw the line. Deep learning is also nothing other than this. It's the same thing. One way to create a deep learning model is to stack a few cells called autoencoders. Autoencoder, the way they work is they have an input layer, they have a hidden layer, and they have an output layer. So the idea is to get the inputs to the input layer, and the hidden layer has a smaller size. Now we are compressing our data. We are trying to see what information actually matters in our data. And then we are expanding it again to represent the features. So I don't want to get into details about that. The reason I'm just putting autoencoder here is just it's a basic building block for a deep learning model, for a deep neural network. So one of the simplest ways you can create a deep neural network is create a lot of these encoders, autoencoders, stack them together, and on the top layer, put a classifier. So softmax is a classifier. It just calculates the weights and says, okay, this is a higher weight, this is class 1. Now feature 2 is higher weight, this is class 2. Feature 3 is higher weight, this is class 3. So it's just a classifier. So you can get your input image, create a few of these encoders, autoencoders, put them on top of each other, send them to a classifier, and create an output. So this is a very simple way for creating a deep neural network. Here is an example, and in your lab later tonight you're going to create one. But I don't want to get into details of this one, because we are going to draw from this to get to convolutional neural networks. Is this important? Let's talk about it later, yeah? The other one is restricted Boltzmann machine. I don't want to get into details about this one again. These are models that have visible neurons, hidden neurons. They try to learn. I don't want to go into details. I have eliminated all the slides on the training and testing this. I just want to give you an idea. You put many of them on top of each other, They are called restricted Boltzmann machines. You put a lot of them on top of each other, and then you send it to a classifier. This is called a deep belief network. Deep belief networks were a hit at the time, back in 2013-14, but they are not that popular anymore. They are not really comparable or competitive enough to compare with convolutional neural networks. But there is an example here on file exchange if you want. So the idea of DBNs is, or autoencoders, is have some simple units, put them on top of each other, several of them, and they keep encoding information, and on top add a classifier, and you will have your output. I don't want to get into details of DBN and autoencoder, and I don't want you to consider them for your exam, but this is just an idea. Feel free to explore them. But you remember that one of the powerful ways that we could extract features from images was linear filtering. So you have a kernel, an edge detection, you remember these kernels, right? You have an edge detection kernel, you have Gaussian filters, you have denoising filters, and what you could do is you could multiply this filter on your image and calculate an output, right? We call this operation convolution. It is basically cross-correlation, but they are very similar with convolution. If the kernel is not symmetric, it must be flipped for convolution and things like that. But the idea is the same. You get a mask, and you start running it through your image. And you generate the output. So, this is the basic idea behind convolutional neural networks. The idea is to find the values in those masks, not to hard code them. You remember in lecture 2 or 3, we could hard code them. We said if this is 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, and then things like that, we could detect edges, we could detect, enhance edges, we could blur the image, things like that. Here, those masks, those kernels, are randomly initialized, and they are convolved on our images. So a convolutional neural network is basically applying those kernels on our images to create an output. And then we keep doing that all over the image. So there are differences here. Number one, if I have a kernel here, and I want to apply it on the whole image, the weights of this kernel all around this image are the same. So by this simple consideration, I am reducing the number of multiplications needed very, very significantly. So I have one filter, I multiply all over the image. I have another filter, I have 100 filters, randomly initialized, randomly run them through the image, and create the next image. Then I have 100 randomly initialized kernels, apply it on this image, and create the next image. Then I have another 100 randomly initialized. You see, this is the way it keeps going. So if you look at those features, they look something like this. So here I'm showing 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 100 of those kernels in layer 1. And they are trained. So you can see that there are different orientations, edges, circles. So these are the ones that are being created in the lower layers from those images, which is exactly what we think is happening in our brain. Our brain, you remember that cat example that we had? If the cat didn't see vertical lines, they wouldn't have the filters to detect vertical lines. But now that they see it in the environment, the brain is learning, is finding those filters. Those neurons in the brain in lower layers are being tuned to those orientations. And now you have cells. Each particular area of your brain responds to one of these. And then it passes to the next layer, and it passes to the next layer, and so on. And we will see now a few more examples what they look like in the higher layers. So this is the basic idea behind a convolutional neural network. You have an input image. You have the convolution operation, 100 initial masks, 3 by 3, 7 by 7, 11 by 11, whatever the size of your architecture. You multiply those masks on your image. You create the first convolution layer. Now we have something called subsampling. What you can do is you can reduce the size by taking a max operation. So in each neighborhood, let's say in a 2 by 2 neighborhood, I look at the values and I take the max and put it in the next layer. So now the size of the next layer is going to be different. So this one was suggested in 1989, the Lunette model by LeCun. But at the time, there were no computational power to do that, and it wasn't that popular. But later, in 2013, when AlexNet came out, then everything changed. In 2013, it was, I believe, that AlexNet was published, and with the state-of-the-art results, which were significantly higher than anything else. Like, we were competing in the range of 55% to 65%, and AlexNet was like 88%. So things significantly changed and draw attention to deep learning. So this is the basic architecture. You have the input image, you convolve it, you create the next layer. You subsample it, you create the next layer. You convolve it, you create the next layer. You subsample it, you create the next layer, and in the end of your model, you have a classifier. Some people are still using support vector machines as a classifier on top. So what these bits are doing, they are extracting features for us. And because of that max operation that we have, our model is very, very well tuned to different sizes, because this max operation keeps happening throughout the whole structure. Sometimes these operations happen 100 times. You have 100 convolution subsampling layers. Now we will have ReLU as well. I will talk about it. So we will look into it in more detail now. This is the basic architecture. Input data, C1 feature map, pooling, S2 feature map, linear classification, and you have the results. In the end, you end up with a feature vector like this, and you send this to your classifier. The classifier classifies it. If these features are good, perfect. If they're wrong, an error signal is generated, the model goes back all the way to the beginning, updates all those weights, and comes back.
You've got color images with the 3 frames. When you pull, do you pull over all of the frames?
Yes.
Oh, so you lose that immediately almost, and it comes up a flat
You
one.
use in deep learning models, all 3 channels are used. In most other models, you just convert the image into grayscale and use it. But in deep learning, you can do all 3 channels at the same time.
So do those 3 channels sort of propagate down? So when you pull, do you just pull per channel, or do you pull?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, so it depends on your structure. It depends. You can do either way. You have a lot of flexibility to do. But the way it works in, for example, in this model, I will get to it later. I will have another example. We can. So let's have a look at this convolution. So what I want to say is I have a neuron here that looks at this area. It's now convolving into this area. So the results are convolved, multiplied, bias is added, and then again I send it to a function. You remember we had a function? We had a sigmoid function, for example, because we wanted to limit the output range. So we have the same function here as well, activation function we call it. So we send that to our activation function and we generate the output. So if you want to show it like connections of neurons, a kernel would look like something like this. These connections are the same weight because you're applying basically the same kernel all over the image. And then you take your next kernel and apply it all over the image. So the kernel doesn't change. The kernel is applied all over the image, so these weights are fixed. So if you have features, kernels that are 3 by 3, and you are applying it on your images, you will end up with just, if you have 100 filters, those filters, once they are updated, you have only updated 100 3 by 3 kernels. You do not need to update 100 times 3 by 3 times 500 by 500. They are not dependent on the size of the input image. Those kernels are fixed, right? So this significantly reduces the amount of calculations. The max layer, as you are familiar with it, it looks at this receptive field, it looks at this area here, and says the max 5, 2, 7, and 5 is 7. The max between 4, 4, 6, 3 is 6. So, these are the learning, training the model. You calculate an energy function, and you optimize the model by gradient descent. It's very similar to what we had before. So you generate an error, you calculate the error, you find a gradient descent, you update your error in a way against it so that you are optimal. So we will go through more, you don't need to know this equation, but we will go through more ways of calculating the error. So, in the end of your network, top layers, you need a classifier. A classifier can be a support vector machine, but usually, because it's a neural network, what they do, they put an MLP. So the last layer is an MLP, basically. They call it a fully connected layer. Because in this case, now every neuron is connected to every other neuron. It's not like kernels that go through the image. In this layer, you have 100 neurons. In the next layer, you have, how many classes do you have? 80 students. You have 80 neurons as your output. So the final result that is generated, for example, it says for the first person is 0.9, the second one 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, 0.1. Then you see, okay, this is most probably person 1. Because the first output is higher. So this is person 1, and your classification works this way. So now let's look at the two concepts called the stride and padding. So here you have an image. You have a 6 by 6 image here, and you have a 3 by 3 kernel. So if you multiply this kernel in this area, what will you get? 1 times 1 plus 2 times 1 plus 1 times 1 plus 1 times 1 and so on. You end up with a value 21. Okay? And if you do this, this is the red one, this is the green one, and this is the next one. So I did the red and green one. But you see, my input image was 6 by 6, but my output image is 4 by 4. Because I am losing these borders. Right? Does it make sense? I couldn't multiply it here because there is no value here. So the first box that I can draw is this one. And I'm taking one step. I'm going 1 pixel to the right. So here, my stride is 1. A stride means shifting. I'm shifting 1 to the right. Stride is 1. And my padding is 0, which means I haven't added any borders around here. This is padding 0. But if I have a 4 by 4 image, but I add a bunch of zeros around it, this is called zero padding. I'm adding zeros around it, and I do the same as stride. I multiply this filter. Now I can multiply it from here rather than here. So if I multiply here, 0 times 1 plus 0 times 1 plus 0 times 1 plus 0 times 1 plus 1 plus 5 plus 0 plus 4 plus 4, I have 14. So you can see with adding zeros around it, the input size is 4 by 4, the output size is 4 by 4. So sometimes we need to have a fixed size so I can add padding. But it's always a function of my stride as well. So if I take this stride 1, and then miss this one and go to the next one. So instead of going one step to the right, I go 2 steps to the right. Then my stride is 2, like this. So if my stride is 2, I take this first one. This is the count result. And then I miss 1 step. I go to the third one. So I'm doing a stride 2. And then I miss the 4th one, and I go to the 5th one. So now again, my 5 by 5 image with 1 padding is converted into a 3 by 3. So the output size is a function of your input size, your mask size, your stride, and your padding. We will see the equation shortly. So now let's talk about pooling, max pooling. These are very simple terms. I just want to explain them so that you don't I don't want you to be scared of convolutional neural networks. It's a very, very simple thing. So you have these numbers here. What is the max of these? 41. What is the max of these? What am I doing? I have a stride of 2. So I'm taking this box, max 41, then I step 2 to the right instead of 1, because the stride is 2. I go 2 to the right. Here padding doesn't make any sense, because if I put 0 padding, I'm always repeating the same number. Max is always the max. Unless I'm going to take a mean, which then padding would reduce the mean, but we should see whether we want that or not. So here I have this area. I'm looking at a max pooling of 2 by 2. If I had a max pooling 3 by 3, I would be looking at this box. And then if I had a stride 1, then I would be looking at this box. Right? So depending on your size of the pooling and your conv, you produce different results. And basically that is why we have different models in convolutional neural networks. So people started with different numbers of layers, different numbers of convolutional filters kernels, different numbers of sizes, different numbers of padding and a stride, and now we have different models. So we will get there. So in max pooling, you have a 3 by 3 max pooling here with a stride 2. You have a 7 by 7 image. You end up with a 3 by 3 image. You have this red bit. The max here is 5. Then you jump 2 to the right. It's 9. Then jump 2 to the right. It's 9, and so on. So now we know what stride, what padding, what convolution, and what max pooling are. Right? Any questions on this? Yep.
We always seem to be driving the dimensionality down. That's an objective.
Because we want to compress the data. We want to do a sparse coding. We want to see if I have 1,000 by 1,000 input, if I get to 500 by 500, is that feature enough to classify all my images? So you don't want to send millions of features to the classifier. This is the way you can, if your inputs are always the same size, you will not learn. But sometimes you increase the dimensionality as well. So we will see it in the next slide.
Does the filter always have to be square?
In most cases, they use an odd number. It's 1 by 1, 3 by 3, 5 by 5, 7 by 7, 11 by 11. But I have seen cases that they are like even numbers as well. But most of the time, they are like odd numbers. Most of the times, if you want to look at the fine details, start with 3 by 3. If you want to look at more coarse details, you start with 7 by 7, 11 by 11, 13 by 13.
But not 2 by 3.
No. I haven't seen that. I don't know whether you can use it or not. So, I think structurally you will end up with problems if you do numbers like that.
But
Anyway.
this could appear in that dimensionality.
Good. So, the equation is here. Output image size is image size plus 2 times padding minus kernel size over stride plus 1. So depending on the way you define your padding and kernel size and the stride, you will have a different result for your output. So one of the first people who did these convolutional neural networks was called Alex. So he named his network AlexNet. And it's one of the most popular models. It's not the state of the art anymore, of course, but it's still very popular. So we are going to look at his model. The input size is 227 times 227 times 3. He decided that I want 96 filters. This is what he decided. My filters are 11 by 11 by 3, because they are encoding colors. And my stride is 4, and my padding is 0. So if I add these numbers here, I have 227 plus 2 times 0. So I have 227. My kernel size is 11. 227 minus 11 is 216. My stride is 4. Over 4 is going to be 54 plus 1, 55. So the next layer is 55 by 55 by 96. He decided that I'm going to do max pooling 3 by 3 with stride 2. He's going to end up with 96 filters, 27 by 27. He decided that I want to then do 256 filters, kernels, which are 5 by 5, with stride 1, with padding 2. Then he ends up with 256 by 27 by 27. Then he does max pooling, 3 by 3 with a stride 2, he generates this. Then he does conv, he generates this. Then he does conv, generate this, conv. So you can see here he's not max pooling anymore. Conv, 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 and then max pooling. So if you follow these, you will end up with something 6 by 6 by 256. Then he sends these 4096 neurons into a fully connected layer, layer 1, layer 2, and the outcome, the final layer, is 1000 classes.
What if the image input size is only 32 by 32?
You have to resize it to 227 by 227 if you want to use this particular model.
So do we use accuracy in that?
It will. You know, basically resizing a smaller image to a bigger image is replicating the values. So in theory, it shouldn't affect significantly. But because once you have, if you have, it depends on the images that you have. If you may lose the small edges, I wouldn't recommend that. These models are bound to having a fixed input size. There are models that are not bound to a fixed input size. But these models, because they have a fully connected layer, they are bound to input size. Other models called fully convolutional neural networks, they don't have these fully connected in the end. Then for those, you can have different sizes. But let's not complicate things here. We have 227 by 227 by 3 as input. So whatever input image you have, you resize it to 227 by 227 by 3. Feed it to your network, and in the end, it generates 1000 outputs for you. So, how it works?
How would he have come up with this design? Would he have done like a grid search on
I don't know. You know, you have to ask him. But there are several different models which are very similar to this, but we will see. But this is magic. Yeah, this is a very good design. But as I explained, there are biological inspirations for that. The idea of convolving and max pulling back to back is biologically inspired. How to do it, he probably did try and error and realized that this model is really working for him. So it's not really magical that he just slept overnight and decided to do it. But we all know that convolutions, then after that, pooling is going to be a good way to do that. So probably this is the way he did it.
So why is the third dimension increasing? Like we start from 2
Yeah.
And then we go to 96, 96 to...
Because it's a 3D, the max is taking over 3 channels. So the kernel is 11 by 11 by 3. So the max is taking over the 3 channels. I will get to that later. I don't want to complicate this now.
So for the kernel, so now we're using 96 kernels, and every kernel presents these different shapes of the kernel scanning through images. Do we need to define, for example, here using 96 kernel, do we need to define what kernel to use?
96 kernels are randomly initialized.
Random initialized.
They are randomly initialized. We don't know what they are. They're randomly initialized. Then we train this model on something like ImageNet with 1 million images, with 10 million images, and it takes like 3 weeks on a proper GPU to train this model. If you have a good GPU and you want to train AlexNet on ImageNet, it takes about 3 weeks' time. So what should we do now? Do I have 3 weeks' time every time I want to generate this model? No. What we do is something called transfer learning. Transfer learning is a way that you use a pre-trained network. Mr. Alex has kindly trained his model on ImageNet and gives us the weights of the network. He says, download my model. It's available online. Download all the weights. It's available online. So now you do not work with random kernels anymore. You have those filters extracted. You have those nice boxes. He's giving them to you. All you need to do is to replace the final 3 layers of his network. The final 3 layers that were doing, they were doing classification specifically to those 1,000 classes that you had. You have to remove those, train your own network based on your input images for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes. If you have a GPU, or if you don't, maybe 1 or 2 hours. If you're using a CPU. Voila, bingo, you have perfect results. That's how you may do your coursework. If this sounds complicated, it doesn't anymore. So let's see how we do it in MATLAB. This is an example. You unzip a march data.zip. It's an example data set available from MATLAB if you want, or you load your own data, your faces. Then you call images equals image data store. You include subfolders, label sources, your folder name, and things like that. You have done this before. You know how to load data into MATLAB. Then you separate your images into training and validation using a split each image. You say 70% for that and randomize and things like that. So far, you have your data loaded. Now, the fun part. Net equals AlexNet. Done. So now you have a network, AlexNet's network, with all its weights uploaded into your workspace. It's very easy life you have. Then you say, I want to keep net.layers from first layer to the last 3. Net.layers 1 to end minus 3. You keep these and call them whatever you like. Layers transfer, because you're doing transfer learning. You define your number of classes. You have 60 students, 70 students, whatever. And then you define your layers as layers equals to layers transfer, which is all those layers up to here. You didn't include the last 3. You didn't include the fully connected bits. Layers transfer, and then fully connected layer, which is now you're creating it. Number of classes, then your learning rate factor, and some other parameters, which you will look into the help to see what they mean and how you can play with them. You have a softmax layer, classification layer, and that's it. Now you have a network which is fully loaded. It has all the weights up to the last 3 layers. The last 3 layers are random numbers. They don't make any sense yet.
So can you think of it as you're using the feature dictionary from AlexNet with your own?
Exactly. This is what you're doing. All those layers, up to those fully connected layers, are just feature extraction from natural images. Now you're going to fine-tune this model, the last 3 layers, with your input data. So what you do is you just say training options. You define some parameters. These are important. We'll go through them a bit. You decide whether you're going to use a stochastic gradient descent with momentum. You're going to use which optimization model, and so on. Then you say my new net is train network, training images, layers, options. Then you wait. If you have a GPU, it maybe takes 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 hour, depending on the size of your input images. If you don't have a GPU, it may take a bit longer, way longer sometimes, depending again on the size of your input and training images. But the key is your input images, they should be 227 by 227 by 3. Even if you have grayscale images and you want to use this architecture, you have to duplicate your gray channel 3 times to create RGB images, because this architecture works with 3 by 3. If you want to use another architecture, you can. You don't have to use AlexNet. We will see other architectures today. But then, predicted labels equals classify, net transfer, and validation images. And then it shows you how good you were, how good your model is working on the validation images. And then you can use the same function for classifying your test images. So this is your coursework. You can just load your data, load AlexNet, play with these parameters, run it, and classify and see how it works. So don't be scared of the deep learning part in your coursework. So, is AlexNet the best thing in the world? No, it was for a while, but people kept coming up with different architectures. One of those architectures is VGG19. So here, the input image is 224 by 224 by 3. The conv layer, the first one is 3 by 3, you have 64 of them. Then it's 3 by 3, you have 64 of them. Then you have a max pooling. Then you have conv 328, and so on, so on, so on. They have VGG16, they have VGG19. So this is VGG19, the layers and what they are. So this is another guy's dream. So he decided that this is a good idea to implement this model. Then we have GoogleNet, because it was Lenet, I think they call it GoogleNet. They don't say GoogleNet, I think. So you have this GoogleNet. Input is again 224 by 224 by 3. So this means you have convolution 7 by 7 with a stride 2 with 64 kernels. Then you have max pooling. Then you have conv 1, conv 3, 1, you know, all these numbers. The thing is, in GoogleNet, you have something called inception. So in inception models, so all the links that I have here, you can refer to them later if you're interested in a particular model. So the inception module looks like that. So the previous layer, they have a conv 1, 3 of them, and on one of those is a conv 3, and another one conv 5. Then on the same one, you have max pool. Then you have conv 1, so they have played with the data. There are some problems with deep learning. You will have vanishing gradients. You have some problems. They try different combinations. They call this module inception module. So the input layer and the output layer are encoding some information from previous layer so that the weights don't quickly go to 0. So don't worry, you don't need to get technical with that, just that you have an idea. Then we have ResNet. ResNet is one of the stronger deep learning models, convolutional neural network models. You have an image and you go through like 152 layers. So the problem previously was after a few layers, your weights used to vanish. Your gradients used to vanish and the model wouldn't be trained anymore. So then they added residual units which looks something like this. The previous layer is added to the outcome of the next layer, and then they go to the, it goes through an activation function and is added to the input. So this is called ResNet. Don't worry about it. And the thing about ResNet is that we have max pulling, we have no max pulling, no dropout. We will see that there are many, many different combinations. And depending on the layers that, for example, in ResNet they have, you can do it with 18 layers, 34 layers, 50 layers, 101, 152, and this is the number of flops that the network needs. So depending on the number of parameters, you can see the numbers are huge. You have billions of flops that you need to calculate for each iteration. So there are these numbers of operations that need to be done. So they take a lot of time. But the good thing about these models is that they are all available in MATLAB or online in Python if you're using PyTorch or if you're using TensorFlow or any other platform, Piano, Caffe. You have all these models available. You can download the model, download the weights, just replace the last few layers, retrain it. They call it fine-tuning. You're fine-tuning it to your data and you will have your results. There is another way that you take the model and train from scratch with your data. Sometimes, if you have enough data, this is a good way because it learns specific features in your data which might result in better performances. But most of the times, we just stick with the natural features that are available in a million online images. They usually have all the features that we want in our images. So, I have 4 or 5 slides which are very important. You have to know them. And one of them is about the activation functions. Once the output of a convolution mask is multiplied on your image, the convolution is applied on your image, the results go through an activation function. We have talked about this before, right? To put a max and min on the output of each neuron. So one of them is radial basis, sigmoid, log sigmoid, hard limit, linear, softmax, hyperbolic tangent, but the most popular one is ReLU, which is a very, very interesting model. We will talk about it here. So all other models are very complicated. ReLU is like that. So it says if the result of if the output is greater than 0, is 1, or it's itself. If it is lower than 0, it's 0. So it's a linear output. It's a thresholding basically, right? So you have ReLU here, and then we have leaky ReLU. So if you don't have ReLU, your line might look like this, but if you have ReLU, it looks like this. So anything lower than that is set to 0, but you have leaky ReLU, which is if the value is lower than 0, just don't set it to 0, set it to almost 0, so that you don't have vanishing gradients. Again, you need to know what ReLU is. Look it up. There's a video here comparing all of these. And if you go to an interview in the future for a computer vision job, they are going to ask you a few questions. They are going to ask you what is SIFT. They are going to ask you what is closing and opening in image segmentation. They are going to ask you what is a convolutional neural network. They are going to ask you what activation functions do you use. They are going to ask you what loss functions do you use. This is for calculating the error. So cross entropy is a famous one, quadratic cost, exponential cost, and so on. You can look into this, watch this video for more details. They are going to ask you which optimizer do you use. Gradient descent, you know what it is. You find the steepest or this orientation in your gradients, and you go against that orientation. Then you have a stochastic gradient descent, which is mini batch gradient descent as well. Instead of calculating that error for every individual image, you calculate the error for a batch of images so that you get a better maximum or minimum rather than getting stuck in a local one. Then we have momentum, which adds a fraction of the updated state of the last time to the current one. Then you have Ada gradient, then you have Ada delta, and then you have Adam. ADAM is the most famous and most popular one these days. It's adaptive momentum estimation. For each parameter, calculate learning rates and momentum changes. You can watch this video here. And there is a more recent version, ADAM-W, which is it adds a weight decay to provide more regularization. We can look at this fast.ai. It's a very, very good website you can look at. They have all the implementations, and it's a very, very good website. So you can look into this video for more detail. The other question they will be asking you is, what do you do for regularization? One of the problems that we have with convolutional neural networks is that they may get overfitted with our training data. And the other problem we have with them is if you train your model on a specific set of images, and in your test images you have the same image but in a different orientation, your model cannot detect it. Because we didn't do any orientation invariance in CNNs. Right? We didn't do like in SIFT, we did that step. But in CNNs, we didn't do that. The other problem is they get overfitted to your training data very easily, very quickly. So you need to have regularization in your model. One of the ways is called dropout. One of the ways is data augmentation. And these are the L1 and L2 regularization, which is to add an extra term to the cost function, which is called a regularization term, which is the sum of the weights in the network. I will explain this in a bit more detail. So MATLAB has something called image data augmented. So you give it your input images, and you say, okay, now reflect my images. You generate more images from your existing training images. You say, rotate my images, translate my images. So the network gets one image and generates 10 different images from that image. Rotates it, reflects it, shifts it here and there, so that your model is more invariant. This is very important. You do it to your training images, not your test images, or your validation images, because you don't want those included in your results. But in your training images, you include those data augmentation. So MATLAB does it very simply and easily. And then you can train your model on augmented images. The other one is dropout, which means randomly on and off some neurons in your model, so that the network is forced to find new ways and is not overfitted to some specific values. So this is called dropout. In MATLAB, you can just say layer is dropout layer. So you can see examples here as well. So, do you mind if the lecture takes a bit longer, or because these are stuff that I like to tell you? It may take, I have another like 20 slides. So, the conclusion of the CNN is that basically your input image is convolved, gone through an activation function in pooling. And this keeps happening several times. Convolute, pooling. Convolute, pooling. This can be in any order, depending on the architecture structure you are using. Generally, the idea is convolute, pooling. This is a very good video again, if you have time. And then, in the end, you have a fully connected layer, network, which is trained on the input data that you have. In this case, X and O's. It just says it's 92% an X, 51% an O. So you say, okay, then it's an X. Just take a softmax.
So, but how can you come up with the, for example, how many filters do you have and the size?
You don't know. We don't know. It's different people have proposed different numbers and they produce different results. But as long as your network doesn't collapse, which means the weights make sense, the input layer, the next layer, and next layer, and next layer, they are properly connected, you can do any number that you like. But these models that I mentioned, they are available. You can just download them and just retrain the last few layers, and there you are. So a convolutional neural network is something like that. You give it a car, another example. Input, conv, relu, n times, pool, then m times this whole bit. Then fully connected, relu, k times, and then fully connected. So in this case, conv, relu, pool, conv, relu, pool, conv, relu, pool, then fully connected. So it tells you this is a car based on the features that is extracted in these layers. And this is just an example of what those features might look like. So these are the responses to those kernels, right? So MatConvNet is an existing toolbox for MATLAB. You can download it, but it is like more old days. MATLAB was behind in deep learning. Like 2-3 years ago, MATLAB was useless for deep learning, technically speaking. It didn't have any deep learning functions or anything. But they're trying to catch up, and now they have almost all the networks with very good illustrations, very well documented. So you can skip this link. VLFit has a MatConvNet, but MATLAB is now much better than that. There are different frameworks. There are libraries out there that you can just download these models from. You can use TensorFlow, which is a Google library. You can just download all of their codes. It's a platform. You just call the functions. You just import TensorFlow, for example, as TF if you're using Python, and then you just say TF dot, call the layers, and then so on. So you can do that for TensorFlow. You can do that for PyTorch. It's another library. PyTorch is easier to implement for academic purposes, but if you are going to industry, most people are using TensorFlow, so you can choose either one. Tiano, Caffe, Neon, they are also there, but they are not as popular. So most people either choose TensorFlow or PyTorch. Different companies are using it, and on top of TensorFlow, there is a wrapper called Keras. Keras is making deep learning even easier. So if you are going to work with TensorFlow, calling those functions might be a bit complicated, but TensorFlow is making things easier. So again, it's like calling less functions and making things simpler. But if you want to have full control over every detail of your model, TensorFlow is best. But if you want to just be able to run it, just test it to see how it works, MATLAB is easiest. You can just open it. But changing layers and playing with the number of the weights you can have, it's a general rule. If you go more low-level languages, it's a bit more complicated to implement and work with, but you will have more freedom. But if you go to higher level languages, it's easier to implement, but you have less flexibility. If you're interested in Python, just Google learning Python, and you will see loads of courses free available. The good thing about Python is it's free, everything available for it. And all of these libraries that I mentioned are free, except MATLAB, which is very, very expensive. And so I do recommend Python, but for this coursework, feel free to use MATLAB deep learning. They're very powerful, they're very well documented. There are loads of applications that are available, libraries. You can use Spider, you can use Jupyter notebooks, and any environment for Python programming. And in order to work with a GPU, first you need to make sure that your GPU is CUDA compatible. You have to go to NVIDIA's website and check for CUDA compatibility of your GPU model. It usually needs a compatibility of 3.1 or higher. Then you can